Thank you very much and good morning to everybody. I'm very pleased to be presenting this paper today, and thank you very much for the invitation to this very prestigious seminar. This is joint work with Tigene Nabasaga, who is presently both a PhD student at HEC Montréal and also analyst at the Deloitte. And I will be, this is a work in progress, and I will be just setting the table to explain what we're doing in that work. So a brief overview, I will talk about the stochastic dynamic game model, and it's the way we represent a loan contract with covenants. And this stochastic game model is solved using a feedback stackable equilibrium concept in discrete time. We have in this game two players. There's the lender and the borrower, and they have different strategies that they can use over time. The lender can punish when the covenant is breached. The borrower can refinance and has decisions about how he manages the loan, so investment decisions. Now, interesting issues here that we will be looking at is when is it convenient to use a safety covenant, and how should it be priced? These are questions that are interesting in the finance world. There's also the question of how to design an optimal contract. This is also of interest to economists, also to finance people. And there's also the issue of the operation of the syndicate. And I want to say that what I put in red here is things that I will not be talking about today, because first, the optimal contract design for the lender, this is something that is in the future work, but the operation of the syndicate, this is a completely different problem, and maybe some of you have heard me talk about this particular game in previous occasions. Now, the outline, I will start by giving you some background. Please bear with me. Some of you know about finance, some of you know about game theory, so I will explain everything so that we're all on the same page. So if ever it's too simple, just wait a bit. And so I will talk about the syndicated loan market, the safety covenants, credit risk, and the feedback Stackelberg equilibrium concept. Then I will explain the game, the timeline, the model, show you the algorithm. I could not do this presentation without presenting the dynamic programming equation for my former students, so it's there. And I will finish with a numerical illustration just to show you the kind of results we get, and talk about the some conclusions, short conclusions, and the work in progress. At any time, if you have questions, please feel free to interrupt. So let's start with the background on the syndicated loan market. Now, what is the idea of a syndicate? It's this loan market is based on the purpose of providing a very large amounts to a single borrower. And the reason why the syndicate is formed is that the amount cannot be funded by a single lender. So we're talking here very big loans. These are usually important projects. Now, salient features that you find in these in this market is the size of the loan first, and also the fact that there are multiple lenders. And this is the reason why syndicated loan market is a fertile field for game theory. Now, where we start here with the beginning of the process, when there's a contract that is signed, a commitment between the lender, which is here the lead arranger, it's called the lead arranger, and the borrower. The lead arranger is the bank that will provide all the contract, the details. And also, the lead arranger is supposed to find the required amount by forming a syndicate and distributing the amount among the interested lenders. Now, these are usually very big banks, and there also exists a secondary market for these this kind of loan, and other parties can buy tranches of the initial loan. And this is also one reason why it's important to be able to price these loans, because they are repackaged and sold in a secondary market. Now you have in these syndicated loans various instruments. What we're going to talk about today is what is called a term loan. And this is a simple loan where you take some money and repay it at the end. But you also have the possibility of having revolving credit facility or standby credit facility. And this is the subject of another part of Tsigene's thesis. So I will not be talking about these today, but it's still the instruments that we're looking at can be used to do that. You have in the fees that are the pricing of these loans. You have first what are called front-end fees, and these are fees that are mostly related to the administration of the loan, the contract, the underwriting, and all that. These are not really important for our purpose. And then you have the annual fees that we'll call interest fees. And the most important part is the rate that is the interest rate, which is a base rate plus a spread, and it can be applied to any to the used or unused amount of the facility, depending on what kind of loan you have. And you also have some agency fees, which are also related to monitoring costs. So they're also administration fees. So the most important fee here that we're interested in is the spread, that is the interest cost for the loan. And I will be talking about the spread during this presentation. This is simply the interest rate. It's the basis plus the spread is the interest rate. You have many possibilities of dynamic games in the syndicated market. You have first the game between the borrower and the lender, and this is what we will be talking about today. So there are many things that have to be done. First, the selection of the borrower. You can accept or not to loan money to the borrower, the efficient contract design, and also the moral hazard and the credit risk that will result from the loan. Moral hazard because the investor, when he has the money, he has limited liability. He could decide to invest it foolishly and not repay the debt. So these are the things that are faced by the lender. You also have the game between the seller and the lead arrangers. And there's also the question of the quality of monitoring, the possibility of hedging the risk, how these loans are going to be shared, who's going to do what. And from the operation of the syndicate, you usually can define a reputation state variable that measures how the lead arranger performs his duties. So this part is about the organization of the syndicate. This particular game I will not talk about today. So I'm only concerned with the game between the borrower and the lender. So now, what are covenants? Now, a formal agreement between two parties. It could be to do something or to not do something. They're called positive or negative covenant, and it's specified in the contract what is allowed and what is not. So here, when we're talking about safety covenants in loans, it comes from the agency problem literature where the optimal debt contract, according to this literature, should include a safety covenant with the possibility of renegotiating the contract as additional information is acquired. So the safety covenant is in fact a way to control the borrower so that, and to avoid that things go out of hand. The safety covenants are widely used in the syndicated loan market. And the reason is because there are large amounts, so a large risk, many lenders, and precisely why the risk is large, it's because since the loan is large, when default happens, the losses are very large. It's not that you have more risk of default in the syndicate loan market, but the consequences are higher. So these covenants are used, I say widely, these are found in practice, and the purpose is to reduce the credit risk. Now, the safety covenants in syndicated loan take various forms, and what they do is that they control the borrower. And one of the most common feature is that the spread or the interest payments can be adjusted when the covenant is breached. So there are ways to see if the borrower is acting in any foolish way, or also if it could be that he is unlucky. And there are ways to adjust the interest payment to account for the fact that the loan becomes more or less risky. Now, this part, the spread that is adjusted when the covenant is breached, this is what we're going to talk about today. There's also a lot of loan contracts that are based on what is called performance pricing. And in performance pricing, what happens is the contract already specifies how the spread will be adjusted as a function of the covenant indicator. Now, this part I will not be doing today, but it's also part of the work. It's based on the same instrument, but since performance pricing, this contract specifies at the outset how the players will react to the breaches in the covenant, it's a different problem. Now, I will show you now some examples of covenant indicators that are used in syndicated loans. Here they are. So these are common examples that you can find. There are databases that record how much they're used and what is used. So these are examples. And if you look at them a little closely, you will see that these are often ratios. They're comparing, in fact, the amount of the debt to the amount of cash flow, assets, or whatever, so just to be certain that there's enough money in the borrower's pockets versus the debt. This is mostly the idea of these covenant indicators, okay? Now, the agency theory in covenant says that if you include a covenant in a loan contract, then the contract is less risky, and this means that the yield should be lower because the covenant reduces the expected loss of investors, and therefore it should lead to lower returns. Now, this is what is called agency theory of covenant, but it's not based on any pricing algorithm. It's just common sense. And in fact, if you look at empirical reports, empirical studies, they do support that financial covenants are priced because loans that include covenants are usually have a lower interest rates, all things equal. Now, the inclusion of a safety covenant could have a very significant impact on the value of the contract. So this is what we're doing here. We're trying to value the covenant, to evaluate what is the value of it using a game theoretical model. Now, we're not the only ones. So there's the first paper, pricing safety covenant, is an old paper, Black and Cox, 1976. And in that particular example, the covenant consists of maintaining a positive equity value over the life of the contract. Whenever the equity value becomes negative, then the loan is terminated and the borrower is forced to file for bankruptcy. So this is what they do, and the model is very simple. So it gives a closed form solution. But the problem with this model is that this simplification is not really consistent with what is the practice of covenant monitoring. Okay, so what is different? Most lenders will not exercise their right to force bankruptcy in practice. Bankruptcy is a very costly process, so most of the time they will use the covenant as a bargaining power when it is breached to renegotiate the loan contracts. For example, they will increase the spread, increase the collateral, reduce the credit line, things like that. And also borrowers are not passive actors because they can also call for renegotiation or refinance. They could find another, well, in syndicated loan, it may be a little more difficult, but they could find another lender. They could say that if since they have a better financial position than when they started, they would like to have better conditions. Okay, so what we're using in that particular application is a covenant model that consists of a constraint that needs to be respected by the borrower at fixed contractual monitoring dates. And if the covenant indicator is at any time lower than some, what we will call the physical default parameter and denote alpha, then the lender forces bankruptcy. And if the covenant indicator is at any time lower than what we call a technical default parameter and denote alpha hat, then the contract will allow the lender to take some corrective actions here, ask for more collateral or increase the interest rate. So now it should be pretty clear what the game consists of. And the covenant indicator we're using is something, yes? Is somebody, it's not. Sorry, is somebody talking? Okay, so the covenant indicator is going to be, again, a ratio. We're using asset valued over outstanding debt. Okay, so let's move. I'm going to give you some background about credit risk and default models very quickly.
Sorry, can I ask a question? Sorry. So, so that the borrower does not do anything. I mean, I guess my question is that this covenant does not impact the borrower's life at all based on what you said, because there is an alpha and alpha hat and the lender would benefit from that. But what about the borrower? I thought that they also benefit from this in case they were able to find another scenario and then they could ask for refinancing or something.
Well, in that particular model, they're not asking for refinancing. They refinance. They can refinance elsewhere. But what is interesting for the borrower is the fact that with the covenant, he gets a reduced interest rate. He pays less interest.
Okay.
He commits to do something that is like to act in a responsible manner.
Okay,
so
thanks.
He gets a reduced rate.
Thank you.
Okay, so what is credit risk? It's the risk that the borrower does not honor his commitment and does not repay the amount due. And it's relatively more important in absolute terms in the syndicated loan market because of the large size of the loan. And how do you measure credit risk? Essentially, you use three components. One is the probability of default. The other is the recovery rate, or what is also called the loss given default, which is the converse. That is how much you will recover if a default happens, and the exposure at the time of default, which is the size of the debt. Okay, so the recovery rate is a percentage of the exposure. Sorry, the recovery is a recovery rate multiplied by the exposure. I mean, this is clear. Okay. Default models are, you have two families of default models. The first one is not interesting for our purpose because this is the model where default is just happening by chance. And we don't want that because we want the default to depend on the decisions of the borrower. So looking for structural models where the default event is driven by the evolution of some structural variable of the borrower. Here, for example, we're using the relative value of the borrower's assets and liabilities. When the borrower has too many liabilities and not enough assets, then it's going to default. He's not going to be able to repay his debt. Okay, and as it went very fast, but you could go back and see that most covenant indicators are based on the relative values of some structural variable of the borrower, for example, asset value, earnings, cash flows, things like that, and some deterministic time-dependent function, for example, the outstanding loan. Okay, so this is what we're using here. So how do you compute the expected credit loss? Well, default is simply a stopping time for some observable state variable, here the structural variable of the borrower. And the barrier is a function of the loan outstanding value. So whenever let's say, the cash amount, the asset value hits this, the value of the debt, let's say, it means that you no longer have enough asset to repay, so you are technically in default. To evaluate the expected credit loss, we need to evaluate the probability of default. This is a first passage time. It usually is easy if you use common models. The recovery rate is based on eventually collateral or bankruptcy costs. And finally, exposure is simply the outstanding loan, how much loan you still have to repay. Clear? So now some background about the Stackelberg equilibrium. Okay, I need to, yeah, I don't see my screen because it's, okay. Okay, feedback strategy for a player is a function indicating the actions that the player is going to take at some date TM as a function of the information available. And what we're using here is a dynamic programming formulation because of the dynamics here. So whenever you have a strategy vector, let's call it delta for the one component for the leader, one for the follower, then the function that is used to evaluate the delta satisfy this functional equation. This is an immediate reward. This is the future reward. If the next state is S prime and the strategy used by the players is delta. And this O here, the zero here that will appear everywhere, it's not very important. It's just a probability that the players are still playing at TM+1. There's no default between TM and TM+1. This is a technical thing. I put it everywhere. It means that you're still there. It could happen that between two decision monitoring date, the follower ceases to exist because he hit this physical default barrier. Okay, and this is this functional equation has to be satisfied for all dates. This is the terminal condition subject to the dynamics of the state variable. Okay, so this is the definition of this strategy evaluation function. Now, what about weak and strong Stackelberg equilibria? When you have Stackelberg game, one of the important problems is the fact that when the follower has multiple optimal responses to the action of the leader doesn't really know, doesn't really have a reaction function, doesn't really know what the follower is going to do. So there's a concept, it's called strong Stackelberg and weak Stackelberg equilibria, where you assume that the follower is going to use some lexicographic order based on the leader's outcome. Okay, what we're using here is the strong Stackelberg equilibrium case. Whenever the follower is facing a tie, she will select an action that maximizes the outcome for the leader. And the reason why we're using this assumption is because these two players are not really, they're not really opposed, because both of them want to avoid physical default, because this is costly. And now using this strong Stackelberg equilibrium assumption does not preclude the existence of multiple equilibria, but it ensures that you have a well-defined response function, action function. Okay, now what is a feedback Stackelberg equilibrium? Now we use, let's suppose a given function, whatever it is, we define the reaction set of the follower to a decision D by the leader at some date Tm and some state S to be the action A star that maximize the total of the immediate reward of the follower given D and A and the future reward given by this function V that is the, for the moment, unknown. Correct? So this is the reaction set, and the strategy vector is going to be a strong feedback Stackelberg equilibrium, and the small v function, which is simply the evaluation at delta star for each player, are the corresponding equilibrium value functions if the following conditions are satisfied in all states and all dates. First, the follower's strategy should be the best response to, in all states, to the strategy used by the leader, given the value of this strategy, VF. And the value for the leader at this delta star should be also the maximum over his action of the value for the leader here. And you see here that I'm using the fact that choosing the action of the follower that maximizes the leader's outcome here, subject to the dynamics of the variable. Okay, so this is a definition of this feedback Stackelberg equilibrium. And what we're using here, now I put this date here to see that I'm very old, because in Breton and Al in 1988, it was shown that the feedback Stackelberg equilibrium is in a multi-stage game is equivalent to a feedback Nash equilibrium in an associated game with twice the number of stages. And this is what we're doing here. We're supposing that decisions are taken by the leader in odd stages and by the follower in even stages. This is in fact a switching control. In odd stages, the leader plays, in even stages, the follower plays. And this is the idea of feedback Stackelberg. This means that the follower is reacting to the actions made by the leader. It can observe what the leader is doing. And the state variable in even stages will include the decisions made by the leader, which are observable by the follower. Now the game, there's a loan contract. There's between the borrower, this is the follower in the group of bank, this is called the lender, and it's a fixed maturity loan. So this is finite horizon game. The loan includes a financial safety covenant. This is a constraint that needs to be respected by the borrower. So the borrower's default state at any given date is determined by the value of this Markovian process, which is observable with respect to deterministic time-dependent barrier, which is simply the outstanding loan. And both the lender and the borrower can take actions over the life of the contract. And these actions will alter the evolution of the lender's process and their respective payoff. The lender can take corrective actions, that is changes in the terms of the contract, and the borrower has some control on the evolution of the firm's structural variable, which amount to changes in this level and mostly volatility. At the timeline is that at some fixed contractual date that we assume here equally spaced to simplify notation, the lender will check whether the covenant has been breached or not. The lender, if the covenant has been breached, the lender chooses among a set of available actions, and the borrower, observing this choice, will react by choosing among a set of available responses. At any time, and this is the reason for the zero that appears everywhere, bankruptcy will occur if the state variable hits the physical default barrier, and the game terminates at the final date T. Okay, now what can the lender do? In case of technical default, the lender can increase the interest rate. and it can increase the physical default barrier. Now, these are examples that we're taking here. This is what we're using in the illustration. Possibly we could consider other actions, but these are the most common. In the absence of covenant violation, the coupon increase and the request for additional collateral is canceled and brings back the terms of the contract. So whenever the covenant, the indicator goes above the barrier, it comes back to the previous situation. Now you should note that when the borrower is not in default, the lender has no available option. Doesn't play. When the borrower can do at any monitoring that, the borrower can choose to refinance the loan, can accept the conditions of the loan, including the corrective actions implemented by the leader, or can file for bankruptcy. Or, and this is one thing that is important here, the borrower can modify the risk level of his investment strategy. This means that he can, this money that he uses in this project, he can do bold thing with this or be very conservative. To simplify here, we assume that the borrower can adopt a conservative or an aggressive investment strategy between two monitoring dates, and this corresponds to a higher volatility and an immediate dividend. So these are taking, I would not say foolish actions, but more risky actions. So there, I will go quickly through the model because I will come, these are all only definitions, like let's say, but I will come back. So there's a state variable, which is the current level of the process. Here we're using the asset value. Decision variables, coupon increase, default threshold. These are the leader's decision variables, and the followers as two decision variables. Followers response, -1, 0, and 1, -1 refinancing, 0 filing from bankruptcy, and 1 accepting the terms. These are discrete decisions. And there's an indicator of the follower's investment strategy. Here we use only two levels, 0, 1, conservative and aggressive strategy. We have lots of parameters that are defined here. What is important to know is that the contractual outstanding debt at any date is something that is known as a deterministic function of time. You have the default parameters that I already talked about. You have the interest rate that in the contract, the risk-free rate and the discount factor that is used to discount cash flows, bankruptcy cost, and the immediate dividend resulting from an aggressive investment strategy. You have functions, this famous zero function, which is the probability of no physical default in the time interval between two monitoring dates. This depends on S, and it depends also on the theta that is used by the borrower. These are observable at Tn. You have the recovery given default. This is simply, you have these, is simply what the leader can recover in case of physical default. You see here, this is a minimum between either getting everything the follower owns minus the bankruptcy cost, which is 1 minus gamma times S, or the debt that is owed to the lender. And the follower gets the rest. Okay, so this is the bankruptcy cost. And you have a refinancing cost at date TM. I did not put the formula here. It's a huge formula. It depends on the outstanding debt, but it also depends on the value of the covenant indicator, because if the borrower is in trouble, he will probably find it costly to refinance elsewhere. And there's a terminal payoff function of the borrower, which is also a complicated expression, which is in fact the equity value at the end of the loan, which depends on how the loan will be refinanced at maturity. This is a function that you can find under some, let's say, classical valuation of the firm. Now the players' payoffs, I will go into that in more details. Conditional to not being in physical default, each player will receive an immediate payoff. And it depends on the value of state variable, and it depends on their action. So here it is. This is the leader's payoff function. Okay, the first term here is the contractual coupon. He puts that in his pocket. The second term is if the follower decides to file for bankruptcy, this is the recovery given default. The third term is if the follower decides to refinance, he has to reimburse. So this is outstanding debt reimbursement. This term is the penalty that the leader is asking for, provided that no default occurs before the next date. The leader will receive that at the next coupon date. Okay, and this is conditional to the follower accepting the terms. And the last term is the recovery upon default, if ever this happens before the next monitoring date. So this is, it's a long expression, but it's a simple thing. And this is the, for M going to from 1 to n-1. Clearly at the end, what the leader gets is the coupon. And at the time 0, well, there's no real action taken. So it's a little different here because you don't have the possibility of the follower taking actions at 0. The same with the follower. The first term is the additional dividend the follower gets if using aggressive strategy. This is the refinancing cost. This is the recovery if the follower decides to default. And this is the recovery upon default if ever it happens before the next monitoring date. This is the final, this is for M from 1 to n-1. This is the final value of the firm of the follower at the end. And this is the value at date 0. Okay. Now, the dynamics, we assuming that the physical default does not happen according to the actions chosen by the players, the state variable will evolve by satisfying some process here that depends on the current value, but also depends on the sigma that depends on the aggressive or conservative strategy of the follower, minus the coupon. This is, I recall, this is the asset value, minus the coupon payment, minus the penalty payment. And the distribution is obtained from here. We're using a standard way to model the asset value of the firm with the standard Brownian motion. Okay, now you should note that both the lender's and the borrower's decision will impact the evolution of this state variable. If you punish, then it reduces the level of the state variable. If you invest aggressively, then you will increase the volatility of this Brownian motion. Okay. Now the algorithm is a discrete time dynamic program over finite horizon. I promise you, I will show it to you in the next slide. It can be solved by backward induction from the known terminal values. And you will see that this dynamic program makes use of these intermediate steps. So we're using also intermediate value functions for the stages where the leader has announced his decision and the follower is reacting to them. And what you get from this dynamic program is the equilibrium total expected discounted cash flows resulting from the loan contract from at any date for any level of the state variable. So this is a dynamic program. Now you see it. Oops, what happened here? Okay, is the final value, value of the firm for the follower, coupon for the leader. And for intermediate dates, what you have is, you see this is the intermediate value Okay, you see that this the follower's value is maximizing by choosing this decision variable, maximizing the immediate reward plus future reward. And this reaction function is simply the optimal values. It's a set of optimal reactions from the follower. And the leader's value here is maximizing the leader's value by choosing given the reaction of the follower. Okay. And the value for the leader is maximizing this Y function with respect to the leader's decision variables. Finally, this is the reaction function of the leader, which is the actions that are taken to maximize this. And we need that because if we have multiple equilibria, we simply choose the best one for the follower in that reaction function. So the value of the follower is this Y function evaluated for the the decision taken by the leader, okay, in the reaction function of the leader. And finally, you have the initial part of this dynamic program. Any questions about that? Okay, what we can do with that, we can find the value of the covenant, find the spread that makes the leader indifferent between a contract with covenant and without covenant, and compute the equilibrium value function for the follower at that spread with and without covenant. Or equivalently, you could also find a spread that makes the follower indifferent between two contracts and compute the value for the leader. This should be more or less equivalent. Now, this is the value of the covenant is what we're working on now. I'm going to show you the results, some results. We're also working on contract design, finding the optimal covenant and the optimal monitoring frequency given the follower's equilibrium strategy. And here is a numerical illustration. As a remark before starting, we have here continuous state variables, so we need to approximate the value functions. We're using in that particular illustration spectral interpolation. And we also may have multiple equilibria. We select the best one. We assume that the leader will choose a strategy that maximizes the follower's value function if it ever happens during the horizon. And we just use, in this example, we suppose that we have a normalized amount of 100 over 1 year with monthly auditing dates. And coupon scenarios, I did not dwell on that, but in this example that I will present you, this is zero coupon. It means that the borrower simply pays no interest over the life of the debt, and at the end of the year reimburses principal plus interest. You also have possibilities where you have a constant debt where at every date you reimburse the interest, or you have amortizing debt where at the end you don't owe anything. These are contrasting coupon scenarios that will make the game different. So these are the base case parameter values. These are based on typical values in the industry. And these are examples of what we get. So this is the equilibrium value function. So this is the zero coupon case. This is the leader, the value function. This is the loan value as a function of the initial asset value of the follower. What you see here is a technical default barrier. So typically in the beginning, you will not have this part. And I will show you how it evolves over time. Now the default barrier is moving because it depends on the outstanding debt. Okay, so this is what we get, equilibrium value function. We have the same for the follower. This is the loan value. I should not, this is not the loan value, it's the value of the firm for the follower. It's the total value, because at the end it gets the value of his asset. This is the loan value plus the asset. This is again at day 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11. So these are pretty much smooth functions that we get here. The leader strategy, it looks like this. Leader strategy, you have here on the left-hand side, the coupon increase, which happens if something is between the 2 default barriers. So the coupon increase, and here is the increase in the default barrier, this increase in the collateral. Okay, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And what you see here, now these are not that important, the results, but you see here that the leader does not always impose collateral increases or coupon increases, because doing so when you're near the physical default barrier could put the borrower to push the borrower to bankruptcy, and this would not be good for the leader either. Okay. And the follower strategy, I haven't found a way to present it in some, let's say, agreeable format, but just to show you that he does things. So these are reactions to depending on what the leader has done and what is this asset value. So you see here that it varies. It's not easy to find like to an easy interpretation. And this is the equivalent spread. It means that if you don't have covenant, what you have here is the amount of interest that you're going to charge at the onset to your borrower. But if you have a covenant, and the solvent line is the amount of interest they're going to charge to the borrower. Now, this is a result of a game. It means that it's quite difficult to explain, and we're still struggling with the fact that the initial, remember, this is the initial interest rate, is increasing with the asset value of the follower. This is for the next time, an explanation. And this is the covenant value for the follower. You see that the follower is always better without covenant, which is not really surprising, because in this particular case, we're pricing the covenant correctly. So it means it should not have value for the leader. And it seems that it doesn't have value for the follower in terms of expected value. Now, what is not included in that model is the fact that the risk is lower. It's only the expected value we're computing. Okay, some conclusions. We have here a tool, the stochastic dynamic Stackelberg game model, and it accounts for strategic instruments that you find in reality, and it accounts for their impact on the contract value. And mostly what we do is we suppose that the lender can monitor the loan and punish covenant violations, and that the borrower can choose the risk level of his operations. And this leads to, it does lead to successive renegotiations. You do have coupon increases, but not all the time. So it depends on the situation, on the asset value of the borrower. So this is what we find. The lender, there's no, it's not a simple strategy. The lender can tolerate some technical default in some states. So it really depends on the date and the value of the state variable. And what we find also is if the covenant is correctly priced, it's not advantageous for the borrower to be controlled by the leader in that way. Okay, and work in progress. What we haven't done yet, we're still working on it, is to see what is the impact of a scenario. It should have a significant impact, as depending on the way the debt is reimbursed, it changes the exposure, it changes the impact of credit risk. So this is something that we have to do now. We're working on the contract design. And we're working on performance pricing. And I want to stress here that performance pricing is a different equilibrium concept as a leader, it's still a stakeholder game, but the leader is going to play an open loop strategy while the follower, it plays in feedback mode. And this is something that I haven't seen, and I haven't found some theory about that, but I just want to say that this is something that is very much seen in practice whenever you have a contract. And if you're specifying in the terms of the contract what you will do in the future if something happens, then you have this performance pricing or open loop equilibrium, open loop strategy for the leader, while the follower can look at the state variable and react in feedback mode. And finally, the last part of the thesis is about revolving credit line, which is different because then the follower also has to decide which part of the loan he's going to use and which part is going to leave in standby. And this is more complex because it's an additional decision variable, but it's also related to the investment strategy. Okay, I guess I'm finished. Thank you for your attention. And if you have any remaining questions, I will take them now.
Thank you, Professor Breton, for this interesting talk and contributing to our seminar.